Today, I'd like, I'd like to tell you a story from the Chandogya Upanishad. But I'm afraid it's a story only in name, because underlying the story, there's a profound philosophy. By means of a parable, the Upanishad analyzes, investigates into the different states of human consciousness. And in the end, it points out that our true self, the Atman, could only be the self-conscious, self-luminous. This self-conscious Atman within, this is also identical with the ultimate reality called Brahman behind the universe. About this, everybody is familiar. Here, the parable very cleverly analyzes the mental states through which our soul passes. And in the process, it teaches how we may avoid mistaking the body for the spiritual self. 1. How the self is not to be confused with dream consciousness either. 2. How it is beyond even the consciousness of deep sleep. 3. And how, finally, it is pure consciousness itself, transcending all physical and mental limitations. So we'll be learning these 4 things today. How we may avoid mistaking the body for the self, how the self is not to be confused with our dream consciousness, how the self is beyond the consciousness of deep sleep even, and how it is finally the pure consciousness transcending all physical and mental limitations. So in this story, we have a progressive spiritualization, a spiritualization of the idea of self, first as the body, then as the mind, then as the ego, and finally as Atman. Because we can't snatch the highest knowledge in one leap. It is acquired as the result of hard, methodical work. It comes after a steady deepening of the mind over several years. We begin with the physical individual, with our ordinary sensuous outlook. Then there is a gradual turning in of the mind, a turn towards the phenomena of dream and deep sleep. Then that introspective mind, which is already turned within, that is guide towards the idea of the inmost self. And at last, the journey ends in the discovery of pure spirit, Atman, which is the subject of all knowing, which always stays awake, even when the mind has gone to sleep. However, before taking up the story itself, I would like to first introduce it with a short summary. I know it means repetition, but I think the repetition is worthwhile. It will drive these Upanishadic concepts deeper into our consciousness. After all, our theme is nothing less than the attainment of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge through an analysis of the 3 states of consciousness. Our parable has just 3 characters: the Creator God, the King of the Gods, and the King of the Demons. Prajapati is the Creator God. Indra is the king of the gods. and Virochana is the king of the demons. Prajapati, the creator, makes a statement saying that the self, Atman, is free from grief, old age and death, free from hunger and thirst, free from all imperfections and limitations. And he says that through self-knowledge, one obtains all the worlds and all desires, to quote the exact text. One obtains all the worlds and all desires. That is to say, if one realizes Atman, one obtains whatever one desires. Both the gods and the demons hear the statement. And as you know, both of them are full of desires crying for satisfaction. So they depute their leaders, Indra and Virochana, to obtain this most wished for knowledge from Prajapati himself. Prajapati, however, doesn't immediately tell them the final truth. After the two have practiced spiritual disciplines for a very long time, they are told just this much: that one's own image, which one sees when looking into the eye of another, one's own image, which one sees when looking into the eye of another, or in water or in a mirror, that is, the image of yourself that you see in any reflection, that is the self. What Prajapati actually means is that the self, the Atman, dwells in all as the seer of seeing, that the self is the subject of all seeing. Unfortunately, Indra and Virochana mistake the self for the person who is seen, not the person who sees. The person seen in the eye is the figure imaged in the eye. So they ask whether the image that is seen in water or in a mirror is also the self. Their understanding is limited. They think of the self as a shadow or reflection, and they identify it with the body. At this stage, it is clear that they confuse the true self with the body. The misconception arises because they take into account only the waking state, which is not enough, which is not sufficient for the purpose of self-knowledge. For his part, Virochana is completely satisfied. He thinks he has understood the meaning of Prajapati's instruction. So he goes back and teaches the demons that the body alone is the self, and that it alone should be gratified, made happy with food, dress, and enjoyment. This is just what out-and-out materialists believe even today. They too follow the doctrine of the demons and identify the self with the body. If we do this, then it goes without saying that according to the Chandogya Upanishad, we too are demons. Indra, though, has doubts regarding the body as the self. He doubts how the perishable body could be the imperishable Atman, because Prajapati had said the Atman is free from imperfections and limitations. So he returns to Prajapati for further explanation and is asked to practice additional disciplines. Then Prajapati says to him that he who functions in dreams is the self. Because the dream self doesn't suffer from the defects of the body. But this solution does not satisfy Indra either. The dream self may be free from many of the limitations of the waking state, limitations that are experienced by the physical body. But still, even the dream state, in the dream state, that dreaming self is also a victim of various forms of suffering. When the pupil presents his difficulties to the teacher, the latter, Prajapati, asks him to practice further spiritual disciplines. Then Prajapati teaches him that in deep sleep one experiences one's true self. But again Indra faces a new difficulty. True, in deep sleep one doesn't feel any of the limitations of the waking and dream states. But one then remains totally unconscious. In deep sleep, a person is not a master of himself. And even deep sleep does come to an end on a daily basis. Not only that, when there is no object to be experienced, no object to be experienced in that state of unconsciousness, how can there be any subject who is the experiencer? Because a subject can be presupposed only in relation with an object. How can there be a subject without an object? So Indra thinks that deep sleep probably represents a state of utter annihilation, non-existence, non-being. Now Prajapati sees that Indra is very intelligent, that he possesses a sharp insight, that he has made himself worthy of receiving the highest knowledge. But there still remain in his heart some impurities on account of which Indra is unable to perceive the truth, although Prajapati has instructed him again and again. So he asks the pupil to practice even more spiritual disciplines. Finally, at the end of 101 years of systematic, rigorous spiritual exercise, Prajapati teaches Indra that the self is incorporeal, bodiless. As long as it is identified with the body, the self appears to be mortal. The embodied self experiences pleasure and pain, but the bodiless self, that is always free from the experience of all the pairs of opposites. So, this is the story. Now let us try to understand the philosophy behind it. Understand in 45 minutes what took Indra, the chief of gods, 101 years. Now, the self uses three kinds of bodies as its instruments. The self uses three kinds of bodies as its instruments in the phenomenal world. When it is seen when the self is seen, when it appears to be moving about in this relative world. During the waking state, it uses the gross body to experience gross physical objects. During the dream state, it uses the subtle body to experience subtle mental objects. In these two stages, the self experiences either external or internal objects. That much is clear. But in the next stage, it exists without the experience of any objects at all, neither external nor internal. During deep sleep, the Atman uses the causal body to experience what? To experience the absence of the subject-object relationship. I'll explain it more fully a little later. Even then, even in this deep sleep, state of deep sleep, where the self is said to experience this absence of anything, even there, that self is not the undifferentiated consciousness of deep sleep. That is the usual misunderstanding. That is the false infinite. The self is even subtler. It is the experiencer of the undifferentiated consciousness of deep sleep. I repeat, the self is not the undifferentiated consciousness of deep sleep. The self is even subtler. It is the experiencer of that undifferentiated consciousness. In all these states, the self enjoys pleasure as an inward spectator, only as a spectator. It doesn't identify itself with the experience. In reality, the self is absolutely unattached. In other words, the knower of the self moves through these three states as the non-attached witness of their experiences. So such a self is totally free from the identification with any sort of body, gross, subtle, or causal. As the Upanishads say, then one remains as the seer of seeing, the hearer of hearing, the thinker of thinking. Now we have an outline of this thought-provoking parable and the philosophical concept it wants to convey. So let us take up both of them in greater detail. The story first. I'll be quoting directly from the Upanishad. Prajapati once said, "The self, which is free from impurities, from old age and death, from grief, from hunger and thirst, whose thoughts come true, whose desires come true, that is to be sought after, is to be inquired about, is to be realized. He who learns about the self and realizes it obtains all the worlds and all desires." The gods and demons both heard of this truth. They thought to themselves, let us seek after and realize this self, so that we may obtain all the worlds and all desires. Thereupon, Indra from the gods and Virochana from the demons went to Prajapati, the creator god. Both of them, Indra and Virochana, both of them were kings, but they gave up their kingships for the sake of self-knowledge and humbly approached their teacher for instruction. So the Upanishad wants to show that self-knowledge is of far greater importance than any worldly aspiration. Then the Upanishad continues, For 32 years they lived with him as pupils. Then Prajapati asked them why they had both lived with him so long. After 32 years, Prajapati talks to them first. They replied, "We have heard that one who realizes the self obtains all the worlds and all desires. We have lived here because we want to learn of this self." Then Prajapati said, "That which is seen in the eye, that is the self. That is immortal, that is fearless, and that is Brahman." When Prajapati spoke of the person seen in the eye, what he had in mind was the indwelling Atman, the seer of seeing. But both pupils misunderstood their teacher's words. They inquired, "Sir, is that the self which is seen reflected in the water or in a mirror?" They asked if the reflection seen in water or in a mirror was not the self. Prajapati's reply was, "The self is indeed seen reflected in these." Then he added, "Look at yourselves in the water, and whatever you don't understand, come and tell me about it." Indra and Virochana gazed on their reflections in the water, and returning to their teacher, they said, "Sir, we have seen the self exactly like ourselves. We have seen even the hair and the nails." Obviously, they assumed that they had seen it very clearly, but they took the body for the self, forgetting that the body is subject to change, and so it cannot be the self, which is changeless. This is the mistake they make. Then Prajapati asked them to don their finest clothes and look again in the water. This they did, and returning to him, they said, "We have seen the self exactly like ourselves, well adorned and in our finest clothes." To which Prajapati rejoined, "The self is indeed seen in these. The self is immortal and fearless, and it is Brahman." And the pupils went away well pleased. So now, first Prajapati had said that the self was free from limitations. Then he indicated that it was the seer of seeing. Lastly, he tried to demonstrate that the body and its reflection were changeful and unreal, and therefore they could not be the self. First, that the self was free from limitations, then that it was the seer of seeing, and then that the body and its reflection were changeful and unreal, and therefore they could not be the self. The body could not be the self. But still, neither Indra nor Virochana could grasp the truth, which means they lacked discriminative knowledge. They lacked discriminative knowledge because their hearts were still full of desire. Because of this inner impurity, that is why they left quite satisfied. Seeing them go away, Prajapati felt sorry, and he said to himself, both of them departed without analyzing, without discriminating, without truly comprehending the self. Whosoever follows a false doctrine of the self will perish. Whosoever follows a false doctrine of the self will perish. That is to say, they will fall from the path of virtue and be ruined. Now, Virochana, satisfied for his part that he had found out the self, he returned to his people, the demons, and he began to teach them that the body alone is to be worshipped, that the body alone is to be served, and that one who worships the body and serves the body gains both worlds, this and the next, the hereafter. Such a doctrine is indeed the doctrine of the demons, the Upanishad says. The word demon refers to people who have a materialistic philosophy of life. Most people believe in and follow this doctrine. We can see it from the way they treat their bodies before and after death. Very few realize that the soul lives on independently of the body. Most people believe that the soul is dependent on the body. However, Indra, on his way back to the gods, realized the uselessness of this knowledge because he is thinking about what he has heard. Because, being a god, he was sattvic by nature, endowed with spiritual qualities. He reasons, this self seems to be well-dressed when the body is well-dressed, well-adorned when the body is well-adorned. So, it will be blind when the body is blind, lame when the body is lame, deformed when the body is deformed. And when the body dies, this self will also die. In such knowledge, I can see no good. So, he has come to understand that there is some defect in how he has understood his teacher's instruction. So he returned to Prajapati and asked for further instruction. Prajapati requires him to live with him for another 32 years, after which he taught him further. Prajapati agreed that Indra was right, but he wanted Indra to cultivate more inner purity, not to become more intelligent, but to become purer, so that he could understand the meaning of the instruction. Self-knowledge is extremely subtle. Then Prajapati taught, that which moves about in dreams, enjoying sensuous delights and clothed in glory, that is the self. That is immortal, that is fearless, and that is Brahman. Now what we have to understand is, the pure self, when associated with the dream body, the pure self appears as the dream self. The Upanishad says, pleased with what he heard, Indra again departed. But before he had reached the other gods, he realized the uselessness of this knowledge also. He thought to himself, it is true that this self is not blind when the body is blind, or lame or hurt when the body is lame or hurt. But even in dreams, it is conscious of many sufferings. So in this doctrine also, I can see no good. So he went back to Prajapati for further instruction. Prajapati now asked him to live with him for yet another 32 years. And when that time had passed, Prajapati taught him, saying, when a man is sound asleep, free from dreams, and at perfect rest, that is the self. The self is immortal and fearless, and it is Brahman. Again, Indra went away. And again, before he had reached home, he saw the futility of even this knowledge. He thought, in reality, one doesn't know oneself as this or as that while asleep. One doesn't know oneself as this or as that while asleep. One is not consciousness. No, one is not conscious, in fact. One is not conscious of any existence at all. The state of one in deep sleep is next to annihilation. I can see no good in this knowledge either. In deep sleep, the self exists without experiencing any object. But Indra thought that in the absence of objects to be experienced, in this state, there could be no subject either. When there is no consciousness of any object, it may also be that the subject, the self, itself becomes non-existent. So once more, Indra went back to Prajapati, who asked him to stay with him, this time, thankfully, for 5 more years. When the last period of Indra's studentship was over, Prajapati made known to him the highest truth of the self. Now, in the objective world, the self functions in the 3 states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. But in reality, it is unattached. Even a qualified seeker like Indra had to spend such a long time, 101 years, as a religious student, under the constant guidance of his teacher. This was the price he had to pay in order to learn this truth about the self. Then Prajapati said to him, this body is mortal, always gripped by fear, but within it dwells the immortal self. This self, when associated in our consciousness with the body, is subject to pleasure and pain. And so long as this association continues, freedom from pleasure and pain no man can find. But as this association ceases, there cease also the pleasure and the pain. I repeat, this body is mortal, always gripped by death, but within it dwells the immortal self. This self, when associated in our consciousness with the body, is subject to pleasure and pain. And so long as this association continues, freedom from pleasure and pain no man can find. But as this association ceases, there cease also the pleasure and the pain. As an animal is attached to a cart, so is the embodied self attached to the body. As an animal is attached to a cart, so is the embodied self attached to the body. I think this last statement needs some elaboration. When the pure self, pure consciousness, when that is associated with the aggregate of the body, sense organs, and mind, that is, when the Atman is associated with this psychophysical complex, aggregate, then it is referred to as the embodied self, Jivatma, or individualized consciousness. This embodied self is endowed with the powers of knowing and acting. The Upanishad said, this embodied self is attached to the body as a horse to a carriage. Just as the horse controls the movement of the carriage, the embodied self, the Jivatma, controls the body, the sense organs, and the mind. In reality, the embodied self is a reflection of the pure self. It is this pure self, pure consciousness, Shuddha Atma, that enlivens, that engages the embodied self, individualized consciousness, in the acts of knowing and perceiving. I repeat, in reality, the embodied self is a reflection of the pure self. It is this pure self, pure consciousness, that enlivens, that engages the embodied self or individualized consciousness in the acts of knowing and perceiving. So, the embodied self is not to be identified with the body. It is only joined to the body as a horse is joined to a carriage. We must keep in mind that this relation is external. It is not something intrinsic. In essence, this embodied self is identical with the pure self, which is totally separate from the body. As we heard right in the beginning, the sense organs are only instruments for its perceptions. The pure self uses the body and the sense organs as its instruments. Then Prajapati continues, rising above physical consciousness, knowing the self to be distinct from the senses and the mind, that is to say, knowing it in its true light, one rejoices and is free. Rising above physical consciousness, knowing the self to be distinct from the senses and the mind, one rejoices and is free. That is to say, the embodied self is liberated when it realizes its true nature, its true form as the pure self, the highest self. The gods, the luminous ones, meditate on the self, and by so doing obtain all the worlds and all desires. In like manner, whosoever among mortals knows the self, meditates upon it, and realizes it, he too obtains all the worlds and all desires. The gods, the luminous ones, meditate on the self, and by doing so, obtain all the worlds and all desires. In like manner, whoever among mortals knows the self, meditates upon it, and realizes it, he too obtains all the worlds and all desires. So, it is not the enjoyment of self-knowledge, and it is not that enjoyment of self-knowledge and its result is reserved only for exalted beings like gods. What the Upanishad means is, self-knowledge belongs equally to everybody. These last lines of the Upanishad, of the parable, emphasizes this fact. Whosoever among mortals knows the self, he too obtains all the worlds and all desires. So, this is the story in full. Now comes the philosophy. A living being is a complex of conscious and non-conscious factors. What the scriptures refer to as the embodied self is the conscious principle in this complex. This is the substantive, the essential part of a living being. This alone is the conscious element in a living being's total makeup. And this self is encased, covered in three bodies ranging from the grossest to the finest, the physical, the subtle, and the causal. As we already know, the physical body is made up of gross matter. It consists of the limbs and the outer organs of perceptions and action. Outer organs. The subtle body is made up of finer matter, that is also material, and the subtle body includes the real organs. The outer organs, as we heard just now, are only instruments. The real organs are inside. So the subtle body is made up of those real organs plus the vital force, prana, and the mind. Then the causal body contains within itself all the characteristics and tendencies, what we know as samskaras, karma and samskara. All this pertaining to that being that the causal body contains in potential form, in seed state. In deep sleep, the mind recedes into this causal body where all its functions remain dormant, sleeping, where all its properties remain latent. Just as the seed is causally related to a tree, in the same way, this causal body is related to the life and career of a living being. That is why it is called the causal body. From day to day, every day, a human being normally experiences these three different states: waking, dream, and deep sleep. This means that the embodied self, the experiencer within, daily dwells on three different planes of consciousness. Accordingly, it also has three types of experience. But these three different experiences, each one of them contradict the other. Three types of experiencing, all of which contradict one another. The waking experience is counteracted by dream and deep sleep. Dream is counteracted by deep sleep or the waking state. Deep sleep is counteracted by waking or the dream state. This we see every day. In deep sleep, a person is aware of unspecified ignorance. Not ignorance of any particular object, not ignorance of this or that object, but a general ignorance. That is also a state of experience. It is not that one is unaware of anything as it is usually supposed. That is why on waking up from deep sleep, one says, I was asleep. I knew nothing. I knew nothing. This shows that there is consciousness underlying ignorance in deep sleep. There is consciousness underlying the ignorance of deep sleep. The luminous self, the self which is ever awake, which never goes to sleep, this self within the person is aware of unspecified ignorance. This is how one is able to recall, I knew nothing. In the waking state, I know what I know and I know what I don't know. That is to say, I am aware of my specific knowledge and specific ignorance. But in deep sleep, I am only aware of my unspecified, to use a technical word, indeterminate, unbestimmt, indeterminate ignorance. The one and the same experiencer has the threefold experience. While the experiences vary, the experiencer remains constant. That is why I say, I wake, I dream, I sleep. That I is constant. Evidently, the same I or the experiencer is at the back of all the varying experiences, whether these experiences are external or internal. That is the fact. That which is invariable in the midst of the variable has to be distinct, has to be different from the variable. That which is invariable in the midst of the variable has to be distinct from the variable. So none of these three states which vary is inherent in the self, who is the experiencer. Even the waking state is not natural to the experiencer. We may spend most of our time in this state, but still we cannot say it is natural. Otherwise, if it were natural to us, one couldn't get out of it. On the other hand, one daily needs deep sleep for complete rest and restoration. So, just as a bird migrates from one region to another without belonging to any, Just as a bird migrates from one region to another without belonging to any, the real person, the real experiencer within also moves from one plane of consciousness to another without belonging to any of them. From the waking state, I pass on to deep sleep or return to the waking state. From deep sleep, I come back to the dream state or revert to the waking state. Again, from the waking state, I pass on to the dream state or deep sleep. That is our daily round of migration. When we investigate into these three states, it reveals the true nature of the self, their experiencer. Consciousness is the very nature, the very essence of the experiencer. But the objects of experiencer, they are unconscious. So the self is self-conscious. It is real to itself. It is always aware of its own existence. It is pure, free, blissful. That self, the real self, is the single constant factor in our human personality. And Advaita Vedanta says that is essentially one with the supreme consciousness immanent in the entire universe. But why is this self-knowledge thought to be the most covetable, the most wished for, begehrenswert? Why? Not because it will fulfill all our desires, ordinary desires. It is coveted because it will help us rise above our desires, to rise above desires. Because the knower of the true nature of the self, when they become desireless, they also become sorrowless. Because desire is the cause of grief. That is why the Kathopanishad says that by which one perceives objects in both dream and waking states, that by which one perceives objects in both dream and waking states, by knowing that as the supreme and the all-pervading self, the calm man does not grieve. And the Chandogya Upanishad says, a knower of the self goes beyond grief. So, if we want to go beyond sorrow forever, this happens to be the shortest and most direct way, analyzing, investigating our three states of consciousness. Thank you.